Hello and welcome to the Reuters Institute and the Global Journalism Seminar Series. On Monday, May the 9th, the Philippines goes to the polls in what is shaping up to be one of the most historic elections in the country's history. It is a country that has gone through everything you can imagine that has characterized the 21st century so far. A populist president, a kind of populist weaponized war on drugs and a cultural war, a kind of system that has led to huge political polarization, a massive flood of messaging and misinformation that has spread throughout the country on all sorts of platforms, including social media. And it has also generated some of the best journalism that we have ever seen. It's generated some of the most courageous journalists we have ever seen, including the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Maria Ressa. It's a really important topic to cover, and we're really delighted today to be joined by Regine Cabato, who has been the Washington Post's Manila correspondent since December 2018. Before working for the Washington Post, Regine was a multi-platform reporter for CNN Philippines, and she also helps run a successful program for student journalists. Her year-long investigation into abuse in churches was a finalist as well in the Society of Publishers Asia Awards. Welcome, Regine. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Mira, and the Reuters Institute.
Could we start with a kind of overview, please, of what's going on in the elections? Would you tell us a little bit about who the main characters are and how this is playing out so far?
Okay. Definitely you're right about it being a bit of a historic and consequential election this year, possibly one of the most consequential ones in the recent history. It's a very crowded race to the presidency with around 10 candidates, but there are some people whom you may know of already. There are candidates who have global fame, such as boxing superstar Manny Pacquiao, not a new name to international watchers. But there might also be other people whom you might not be so familiar with, like Manila Mayor Isko Moreno. So those are some of the people who are in the top four. Both Pacquiao and Moreno are 40-somethings with rags to riches stories. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with Pacquiao from his career as an athlete. And he's juggled that with his work in Congress and the Senate before retiring last year. Moreno, on the other hand, true to the showbiz nature of Philippine politics. He used to be an actor before he joined the local government. And then he became more popular after he became Manila mayor, defeating a former president for the post. And he was widely perceived to have cleaned up the city, quote unquote. So both the campaigns of Pacquiao and Moreno have been interesting because in a country where politics is mostly dominated by powerful families or dynasties, it can be very difficult for upstart politicos like that to enter the scene. But then these two candidates were able to make up for that because they do have star power. Pacquiao is an athlete, Moreno is an actor. And they're also some of the candidates who can really say or brand themselves that as pro-poor because they have experienced poverty, unlike a lot of elites in Philippine politics. But very quickly, analysts are definitely saying that the main story of the Philippine election is how it's going to become a two-way race between the top two most popular candidates in surveys, and that's Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the son of the late dictator, and opposition candidate Leni Robredo, the incumbent vice president and the vocal critic of President Rodrigo Duterte, who's most known for his very bloody war on drugs. So just to clear things up, because it might be confusing to foreign watchers who are not familiar with the Philippine system, a president and vice president here are elected separately. So that's how it's possible that Robredo can be a critic of the president, even though she's technically a member of the administration. That being said, Marcos Jr. Was a former senator. And of course, he is a Marcos. And a bit of a history lesson, you guys have probably know that the family is quite notorious. It ruled the country, his father ruled the country for 2 decades, including around 9 years under a brutal period of martial law. And that period saw disappearances, detentions, killings, and the torture of tens of thousands of people, as well as massive corruption. They're estimated to have stolen up to $10 billion from public coffers. And then they fled to Hawaii after the 1986 revolution. Robredo, on the other hand, her background is a lot simpler. She is the wife of a former mayor of a city in the Philippines. But after he died in a plane crash, she was propelled to the Congress and a grassroots campaign. And since then, she was able to rise up to the vice presidency. And she actually narrowly won the position in 2016 against Marcos Jr.
Yeah.
So what's happening now is basically a rematch between the two. Roughly, that's a bit of a rundown.
That's a brilliant summary. Thank you very much. What's it like covering this campaign as a reporter? Because you've got celebrities who are unwilling to talk to the press in many ways. I think Pacquiao doesn't really want to do press interviews. And then you've got other candidates who are from the Marcos family, but are trying very hard to play down their connections. So how do you tell the story of what's going on?
One of the things that have pretty much defined this election is really social media. So as we may have already seen in 2016, but it's more pronounced now, a lot of politicians basically can take it upon themselves to produce content that's favorable to them. So they don't necessarily need the press. And we see that particularly in Marcos Jr.'s campaign. The Foreign Correspondents Association of the Philippines, which I'm a member of, has just released a recent statement about our concern about how individuals from over a dozen member organizations have not been able to get accreditation to cover his town. Okay. Pacquiao, I would say, is one of the people who is more open to the press, definitely. The other candidates generally are as well. But for sure, social media and the ability for anybody to create content about a certain politician has changed the game for sure. Yeah.
And so what's your response been to that, beyond kind of asking for access and protesting when it's denied? What else has been done?
In my particular case, I kind of did expect that Marcos Jr. may be difficult to cover, precisely because it's very hard to get a hold of him. Local press in particular may have experienced, and if you guys may have seen this online actually, because some videos have gone viral, local press really struggle to basically get an interview from him. Like doorstepping interviews, as they're called in the UK, are called ambush interviews here. So they kind of have a really bad sound of the ear. Like they sound like a bit like an assault, right? But BBC's Howard Johnson, for example, just recently, he doorstepped Mr. Marcos to ask why he wasn't doing public interviews, or if he could be a good president if he wasn't doing that. And Marcos just laughed and didn't answer the question. And when Howard posted that video, it just resulted in this crazy, crazy barrage of hate for him. And
for who? For the journalist or the politician?
Yes, the hate for the journalist.
Yeah.
And that would even translate to death threats, actually, or death wishes. So how are we preparing and responding to that? Definitely, we are talking about it as organizations. Outside of work, we, especially during World Press Freedom Day, we're trying to discuss what else we can do to organize. I think definitely Filipino journalists need a bit of help in the digital security front, especially because troll farms are so prevalent here. So that's one way, definitely, that we're preparing. But because it was so hard, how I prepared personally was because it was so hard to cover him in a physical sense, that is trailing his sorties without a clear schedule. I looked at some other evidence which was a trail that I could find, which was the online presence of Marcos Jr. And what came out of that report was a deep dive into historical revisionism, which we published on the Post, and where we basically spoke to researchers and public relations industry insiders who talked about how the rehabilitation of the Marcos name is the product of a decades-long, well-funded, well-planned PR campaign. When we published that story, it made a bit of a splash, and I got also a lot of hate for that from a lot of suspicious accounts online as well. But it seems to be steadily becoming something to expect if you're a journalist in the Philippines.
I'm really, really sorry you underwent that. Let me just stay on it for a while. Firstly, are you okay? Yeah.
That's a very good question. To be honest, I haven't really sat down and thought about it yet because I've been so busy with the rush of election coverage. But of course, I was definitely. It's hard to say that you get used to it because you really don't. Especially for us women, right? There is a certain sense of violation that comes with that invasion of space, even if the space is just your inbox, right? A lot of remarks, I would say, were definitely sexist in nature. A lot of words like prostitute, hornalist. I kind of sat on it for a couple of days, to be honest. And this is around my third harassment campaign. By harassment campaign, I mean it's just this period of time which I kind of suspect and I'm sort of half sure is definitely engineered by a troll farm because the messages are sent at roughly the same times. So there's definitely a window in which the messages come in. And then the messages are mostly scripted. They attack your credibility. Like they go by there is a certain messaging that comes with it, right? I don't doubt that some of those are real people though, but there are some that are definitely suspicious. So this is my third harassment campaign. And this time around, I kind of tried to busy myself because I didn't want to sit and be steeped in my thoughts and in the online vitriol. So the very next day, I stepped outside and I went on field coverage and did interviews just to get it off my mind. And when I came back to my computer, I kind of thought that for the first time, instead of just ignoring it as I usually did, that I would kind of record it and do a bit of a voiceover and walk people through what my inbox is like. And that post also made a bit of a splash. Obviously, not as viral as the initial share of the article, but for people who were in my following, I think it definitely let them in on what it's like to be a journalist in the Philippines.
Wow.
You just
and what was the response? Were people supportive or shocked?
Definitely people were supportive. And I'm very grateful, I would say, because people, I think, in my direct circles, I am very just grateful for the moral support that I'm surrounded by. People were checking in on me, although, of course, I've been so busy because of election campaign coverage, right? But for a lot of people, they were, despite all this, they were quite shocked still. One thing I think that really drove home the point was because when I scrolled down my inbox and I caught all of this in a screen recording, you could see the spam messages that I had received from my previous harassment campaigns back in 2021, 2020. And you could see that a bunch of those accounts had been suspended. They were just blank accounts, which were very telling that they were probably taken down for coordinated and authentic behavior. I think that was the first time that a lot of people saw that there was a very real possibility that a bunch of these accounts were generated and not real at all.
And did you report anything to the authorities at all?
My bureau chief is definitely aware of this. I'm still crafting the report to Facebook.
Okay.
Although, yeah. So that's something I'm working on as well. The Foreign Correspondents Association has drafted, has in its statement said or called on social media to really respond to attacks like these, because the case was quite similar with Howard Johnson of BBC, as well as with another colleague of ours who had experienced a barrage of harassment as well.
What do you think has happened in the Philippines for this to become such a regular occurrence, this kind of pile-on? I know that that President Duterte has been very critical of the press and this kind of weaponization of troll farms, but it strikes me that there's something broken in the kind of connection between journalism and the public in many cases as well. And what do you think is going on there?
Yeah, the rapid deterioration of the trust in the free press. Definitely, the hostile administration of President Duterte has been a factor. But the fact that it deteriorated so quickly is also telling of, I guess, the faults of the press and being able to adjust to this digital landscape and then being able to feel out its audiences. Um, the Philippines has been traditionally known, especially after martial law, to be one of the freest presses in Asia. And look where we are now. We're still, we score so high on the impunity index. We are still considered to be consistently one of the worst places in the world to be a journalist. There is a generation gap in newsrooms that I think was a factor, because we didn't get to migrate to digital spaces fast enough.
Okay.
And we're seeing that even now with new spaces like TikTok, and with how YouTube has taken hold, even though YouTube is a bit of an old space, but it's steadily becoming, according to research, one of the favorite places for Filipino audiences to go. Definitely, we've stuck, I think, to a traditional media model for quite a long time. We've clung on to that. And influencers have taken over, and we see that now in the election campaign, because a political client can just hire an influencer and the influencer can say whatever they want, but we wouldn't know whether or not that influencer is on the politician's payroll or not, because they could package their content as organic, right? So that's basically one of the things, definitely, that has helped to make things harder for the press.
But this, I feel like I want to frame your words and put them on a wall, but this is why digital innovation matters, and it's vital.
Yeah.
Once you lose people, you lose the entire country. Staying on that point, on what politicians are doing on social media, could you talk us through a little bit about how they're using social media for their campaigns? So you've mentioned influencers or buying in influencers. What else is going on in that space?
A lot of very interesting trends, and I would even say innovations, are taking place in the Philippines. So definitely you have influencers. Under that, one thing, according to a public relations strategist, is that politicians tend to hire micro influencers, right, as opposed to bigger influencers. Yeah. Micro influencers meaning that these people, whom they call key opinion leaders, or key online leaders, or something to that effect, they're basically people who may have a following of just a few thousands, but it could be a loyal following. It could be a very targeted following. So when I was looking at micro influencers who were pro Marcos on TikTok, for example, there would be people from the LGBTQ community. There would be people would be someone who's like a public school teacher. So basically, these could be people who come from different sectors, and politicians who need to basically market themselves to a certain audience would pick a micro influencer who fits into that profile. So that's one trend that we're seeing. Another one is the buying and selling of Facebook pages and groups. So one sneaky thing that political operators have been doing is basically buying pages and groups that have nothing to do with politics, say celebrity fan pages or entertainment or history enthusiast groups. And then suddenly the groups would change into something with a political agenda. So if you're somebody who is a completely undiscerning online person, you may be scrolling through your feed and then suddenly you see a plug for a certain politician and you're like, when did I like this page? I did not remember liking it. But you slowly get a steady feed of content from this page or group. And the prices for this stuff could actually be really cheap. ABS-CBN, a local broadcaster, had an investigation of how you could actually buy a page through Facebook Marketplace. But they could also go pretty high because there was a TV show host who also works for ABS-CBN, who shared on Twitter that he got an offer to sell his fan page for 1 million pesos. And the fan page had around 2 million followers. So that's how high these prices can go. And that's how money the machinery can be.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Maria Ressa has talked about this for years and has highlighted the kind of the misfunction of the digital space in the Philippines, and said very clearly, you know, what's happening in the Philippines will come for the rest of the world soon enough. And she's been right on this. So this is really, really a crucial point, which is why I asked you, because I think it's something people need to look out for everywhere. I'm going to go to the journalist fellows in the room now, because I think Hannah wanted to ask one question from that.
Hi, thank you so much for being here with us. I was wondering if you could tell a little bit about how the international attention that Maria Ressa has gotten has affected the local media landscape. I imagine it can both be a blessing and a curse to have somebody become an icon like she has become.
That's a pretty good question. Definitely, Maria is quite an icon here in the Philippines. But there have been so many cases against her that just make it so hard, I guess, for everyone. I mean, a lot of newsrooms locally, and I guess I can say this because I'm a foreign press journalist, have been self-censoring because of what has happened to Rappler, as well as what has happened to ABS-CBN, which is the biggest broadcaster. For context, in case some of you guys are not familiar with the case, ABS-CBN was stripped of its franchise. Its franchise was not renewed. And it's because the Philippines has this weird model where Congress has to, grant permissions for these big media organizations to operate. And of course, the press and the industry and advocates knew that this was a way of stifling freedom of speech. But because it was a Congress decision, hidden behind red tape reasoning and stuff like that, basically people, politicians were saying that it was, pretty much like paperwork reasoning or tax reasoning, etc. Even though ABS-CBN was pretty much cleared of its tax payments. So cases like that, and both Rappler and ABS-CBN have been cause for a lot of self-censorship by local newsrooms. And in some ways, that is also it's one of the worst kinds of censorship, because you stop yourself before you even get to ask, right? So of course, like, Maria is great and all, but we definitely need more support as well. We look up to her definitely for all the work that she's doing, for all the lobbying that she's doing. But local journalists on the ground, they are in hot water, pretty much. I'm not sure that answers I hope that answers.
No, it absolutely does, and it's really insightful. What kind of support do local journalists on the ground need?
Definitely digital security is one. Because like I mentioned earlier, you're very vulnerable to harassment, to attacks. And a lot of local news sites have experienced distributed denial of service attacks, hacking as well. Individual journalists have also been hacked. And in a couple of cases, or in one recent case, a freelance journalist was hacked, and then his account started spewing pro-Marcos propaganda. So definitely, we'll need more help on that front. One of the difficult things as well that makes it hard for local newsrooms to operate in the Philippines is because of business models. Institutions in the Philippines are not that strong, to be honest. So there is a lot of influence still from business owners. And really, that's where a lot of the self-censorship or censorship can come from. So Maria definitely cannot be alone in this fight. We have to find ways to help her out as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I'm going to go to Paul in the room. Follow.
Hello.
Hi, Paul.
Thank you so much. Hello, Regine. Sorry, we were just on mute. Thank you. I mean, it's lovely to get your input. I was a political journalist myself, and I'm always very interested in the run-up to elections specifically. I guess what I found quite interesting is the vast use of social media in the run-up to your campaign. And it's clear that in some instances, you mentioned in the past that some mainstream media outlets have been blocked from covering certain press conferences where social media influencers have not. How has the media in general, or some media titles, responded? What can you still do to ensure you play a role in not only informing the public, but also that the news is accurate and there is no misinformation which can be easily manipulated on social media? What can you do in this context?
There are definitely some efforts on the ground already to address that. But whether or not they will really make an effect or impact on the elections, or whether or not it's reached enough audiences, still remains to be seen. But one of the ways that journalists have been organizing are fact-checking initiatives that go across the board. So there are fact-checking coalitions, orgs like, or initiatives like Facts First PH, as well as Viber channels and other Facebook groups where people can flag disinformation, and then they can be run through a fact checker, or people can respond. So that's definitely one of the ways. I've noticed as well that these fact-checking initiatives are stepping up their game in terms of collaborating with creatives and influencers who have like-minded values to create more creative stuff that explains fact-checking to a general audience. So definitely those are some things that were done in the run-up to the elections. But one of the things about this election in particular is that it's a race against time, because the disinformation has been seeded there for such a long time. Like, it has just, been allowed to stay up on these sites and just be discovered by whoever goes through Google or YouTube or Facebook. And it's really borrowed itself into the subconscious of a lot of people. So whether or not the fact-checking, the definitely great creative fact-checking initiatives are making a dent, we'll see, I think, in the upcoming elections. I mean, but we have to keep at it.
You're describing a media space where the media is basically not visible, where it's not present, where they're not allowed into many press conferences. Marcos kind of prefers YouTubers and TikTok influencers, and then fact checkers and influencers are kind of combating misinformation. It's quite hard to see whether journalists for the local press are able to operate.
It's quite difficult, definitely. In our statement, we kind of pointed out how we don't get accreditation. In some cases, according to people who are on the ground, schedules have been withheld. There are the ways that some journalists go about it is definitely to talk with each other and to find other ways of covering, I guess. You have to be creative, you have to be quick-footed, and sometimes the non-answer is the answer. Like in Howard Johnson's case, right?
Yeah.
But definitely we can't keep at this forever. And the presidential candidate, especially if he's the leading one who might become head of state, he can't stay in an echo chamber forever. So definitely one of the things that the press worries about in event of a Marcos presidency is the further institutionalization of these propagandists who are completely hyper-partisan, who hate the press, who sow distrust for the mainstream media. There have definitely been talks among the press about how we can push back. But we can't really do that so effectively without the help of social media platforms, because they're the ones who basically enable these propagandists to operate. And in some cases, the propagandists even profit off of the social media platforms business model. So that's definitely one thing that puts us in a sticky spot. Yeah.
Thank you. Suprova, you want to kind of follow on from there?
I was really fascinated to hear what you said about influencers and their role. Wanted to ask, does this widespread use of social media mean that there's more citizen journalism? And just in terms of like who's consuming your content, like are people listening to the influencers more than traditional media?
So I just repeat, because some of it was a bit fuzzy. Is there more citizen journalism as kind of a result of this online space? And are people listening to the influencers more than traditional media?
Actually, people tend to look for the traditional media, I would say, in moments of disaster, like typhoons. And the Philippines is always fraught with climate crisis emergencies. So every typhoon recently, especially ever since ABS-CBN was taken off air, a lot of people would be in the dark about how to cover. And these are the types of stuff that kind of make people realize, every rainy season that, oh, maybe this is why the mainstream media is important, because that's the type of things that an influencer isn't trained to cover, right? So definitely that's one spot where people do turn to the media for that kind of information. But it's also, I guess, an opportunity for the press to assert themselves as the entity to go to be trusted. Unfortunately, because everything is so polarizing now, like Marcos is such a divisive candidate, even though he packages himself to be the unity guy. That's one of his main slogans or themes for this campaign. Because it's such a divisive and polarizing atmosphere, there are a lot of people who actually would not listen to the press, and who do prefer to listen to bloggers because they've been so steeped in confirmation bias already. It's going to be very difficult to undo, and it will also be the job of people surrounding them or people in communities, or community journalists as well, to engage with these types of audiences directly. One thing that Maria Ressa had warned about when we had a conversation earlier this year was that this kind of online hate would help to modify behavior. We've seen that in the US, right, with the January insurrection. In the Philippines, we can't say that it's that bad just yet, but we are seeing little bits and pieces or a preview of that kind of possible violence on the campaign trail for the opposition, because one of the opposition's ways of campaigning is going door to door and talking to people face to face. It's supposed to be a way to counteract how people don't talk online anymore because everyone's stuck in an echo chamber. So it's strategic. It's meant to strike up genuine conversation. And basically, a lot of volunteers have found out that they can still change a lot of minds, and that a lot of people are actually still open to political conversation that's civil. But there have been a few instances, or well, not really a few, but scattered, or just few relative to the people who are open to conversation. But there have been instances of people who are outright violent, or who threaten and heckle volunteers, who basically don't want to talk at all, who believe who believe the press and facts are not real. And those are some of the ways we already see that behavior modification working. So that's definitely something that might grow even more in the next 6 years in the event of a Marcos presidency.
Thanks very much. Robin, I think your question follows on very nicely.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, this is quite a big year globally for elections, and I wonder whether there were things that are happening right now in the Philippines that that reporters in other countries might kind of look out for when it comes around to their elections, especially with populism, like covering populism. Because a lot of reporters obviously won't have covered an election for maybe 4 or 5 years. You know, a lot can change in that time, especially with social media.
Okay. One interesting thing, especially in terms of populism, is that President Duterte is practically retiring, having, with his popularity, having survived the drug war, which was, of course, very controversial, but still somehow a very popular policy, as well as pandemic response, even though a lot of people had so many complaints about pandemic response. And in some ways, it was also because, or in part at least, because the president was quite couched as well. He was surrounded by a whole communications machinery, and there were troll farms that would attack people who raised complaints and such. I'm not sure to what extent that's helped shape public opinion, but definitely it probably has, because his daughter is one of the is practically the survey topper for the vice presidency alongside Marcos Jr. That's one other thing to watch out for, because that tandem is definitely the one to beat in the Philippines. They're expected to further cement dynasty rule, and some human rights and basically policy analysts worry that a Marcos Duterte tandem, both being children of strongmen, is just going to weaken institutions and weaken democracy. On the other hand, the opposition candidate, Leni Robredo, is running on a theme of radical love, which you guys may have heard previously from Turkey. It was used by the opposition against Erdogan. And now they're translating that to a local, like Filipino context. So her campaign is actually very lively. It's volunteer driven and it's unmatched. Like you have millions, like around 2 million volunteers going house to house, producing content for free, fighting trolls for free. You have movie stars going on these campaigns, rock stars playing at her rallies for free. It's something that is definitely something to watch out for, because even though she's behind in the surveys, it shows that her following is willing to fight for her. And it is a rough estimate probably of the people who are willing to show up and have her back if Marcos does anything wrong, right? So that's going to be really interesting. Some analysts think that it's going to be a very close race, even though the surveys look a bit bad at the moment. But if she manages to pull off a photo finish, it's definitely going to be a model for other countries to look at for a future after populism. Like how you can, utilize that radical love playbook.
Tell me a little bit more about the radical love. You talk about the volunteers and the liveliness of the campaign. What's the messaging?
Definitely, the radical love messaging has been about listening to supporters of populists as opposed to talking over them. So that's something that we saw in Turkey. And Robredo's campaigners did tell me that they borrowed directly from that playbook, because definitely, you can't beat them by butting heads with them outright, especially because these populists are so popular. Like there's a reason why they seem to resonate with people. One other thing about this type of campaign is that it seems that it ought to emphasize gut issues more, common issues more. So a lot of stuff that Robredo is emphasizing really has to do with jobs, really has to do with agriculture, gut issues, economy, like people can feel, and that will trickle down. Because if you talk about stuff like the drug war, like human rights, there seems to be a kind of desensitization to it. And a kind of moralistic high ground that people who are, of course, the opposition previously would, just kind of be frustrated by. Like, why do people not get that human rights violations are bad? But basically, for some sectors of the population, they don't feel it outright. Like, there is a bit of a detachment because, oh, it didn't happen to me, it didn't happen to my family. And you can't make them care right away. So that's definitely one of the things that the love campaign tries to point out. Like, you have to meet people where they are. You can't talk down on them or kind of take a moral high horse. You explain these issues once you talk to them about what their own issues are.
It sounds eminently sensible to me.
Yeah.
Strategy.
And it's so hard to do, right? Because of how social media has conditioned us basically to be so divisive. If you disagree with someone, it's so easy to unfriend them, right? But yeah, so definitely those are some of the thrusts of the campaign. But of course, the campaign has also been under a lot of attack by disinformation. There are just lots of crazy conspiracy theories about Robredo, how she is supposedly linked to communists. There's one crazy theory that she killed her husband. So she's definitely the target of attacks. And whether her volunteers will be able to debunk enough of those in time for the elections, we'll see.
What do you see happening to journalism in the Philippines if Marcos wins, and then also if Robredo wins?
Okay, definitely. Like I mentioned earlier, if under a possible Marcos presidency, we can probably expect that propagandists, hyper-partisan influencers will be more empowered, and that will make the job more difficult for journalists. Yeah. We're very worried about access, of course, like we mentioned in the recent press statement that we released, because how a candidate acts on the campaign trail is pretty much a window of how he's going to govern, right? And if just now it's very hard for us to get comment on the various controversies surrounding Mr. Marcos. Yeah. It's just going to get harder as time goes by. We're not expecting a lot of freedom of information, if ever. That's going to be the case. In event of a Robredo presidency, I think it's fair to say that a lot of the press are expecting that it's going to be friendlier. Her camp has been more open to the press, definitely, more understanding, and she's open to criticism as well. So definitely, that's something I think that the press is cool with. But yeah, so that's one thing that I kind of noticed and that I mentioned in the forum the other day, is that I think that there's something that the press can learn from the volunteer-driven creative content that is coming out of Robredo's campaign. Because there's so many ads that come out for her that are basically done pro bono by all these creatives, these musicians. And a lot of that counters the disinformation against her or tries to paint her in a positive light, etc. And I'm kind of wondering how you can channel that energy into a non-partisan project, like restoring public trust in the media. So I think definitely we could look at how creatives are taking the campaign and see what we can learn in terms of public relations for the press to restore trust in the institution.
That'd be a really interesting forum to have. I mean, you talk a little bit about Leni Robredo because she's a woman in a kind of very male-dominated space, and you've also talked about, as have many women, the kind of very gendered nature of attacks and disinformation that's spread about her. So, firstly, what kind of attacks, without asking you to repeat kind of rumors or things, what's the nature of the attacks against her, and crucially, what's her role in the campaign? Have there been there's been a suggestion that possibly she steps aside to let others.
Yeah. So the attacks against her, I've mentioned some examples earlier, can become very absurd But definitely one of the things that fact checkers have noticed is common is splice the video of how she speaks to make her look quote unquote stupid, basically, or incapable of leading. Like she's portrayed to have a stutter or not really think straight when she's sharing her ideas, which is actually pretty far from how she conducts herself when she does public speaking. She also attends all the debates, which all the crucial debates, which Marcos Jr. has opted out of. But on social media, there is an alternate universe where you will see people really believe that she is up in the air. That's the Filipino, the translation for the Filipino word for it. One particularly below the belt attack was actually targeted not against her, but against her daughters. It was a manufactured scandal, pretty much, sexual in nature. And according to one veteran public relations strategist, it has been the dirtiest tactic that he has seen from all the elections that he has handled. Once that came out, or news of that broke out, and they called platforms to take down these non-existent videos, but which were labeled with her daughter's names, there was this troll farm line of thought that went around claiming that her own camp had manufactured that video in order to get attention or something like that.
Mhm.
And there was a section of people, I think, who bought this line of thought. So those are some of the sexist ways we see things playing out. The other thing that Mira mentioned was an interesting development where there were where the survey runners up, basically Moreno included. Pacquiao opted out, interestingly. Ping Lacson, a former police general who is also running for president, as well as another guy as well. They had a joint press conference where they were basically reiterating that they wouldn't step out of the race. And the kind of tone of that was that there were feelers from Robredo's camp that were asking them or implying if they would step out so that some of the votes could shift, so that someone could win or have a better chance at winning against Marcos. So in this particular press conference, which was kind of widely pandered to be a bit of a sausage fest or a bit of a men patting each other on the back by some analysts, Moreno kind of went on to say that it was Robredo who should withdraw, and of course a lot of her supporters, analysts as well, said that makes no logical sense because she's the second person in the surveys. She's the one who has the most chances of beating Marcos. So why are you asking her to withdraw? And of course, the undertone for that was, well, it's because she's a woman and, there is a sense of entitlement that's going around. And that was definitely a discussion for that news cycle.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Paula.
Hi, hello, Regine. I am Paula from Chile, and I would like to ask you about, you mentioned it briefly, the war on drugs from Duterte, which was such a brutal policy and left so many victims. So I would like to ask you if you could tell us more about how that issue has been part of the campaign, and also if there is some hope for justice against in the cases of people who are victims of that war.
Okay, a really good question. So the drug war policy, in theory, minus the killings, was actually popular in the Philippines. And right now, the kind of news stories have evolved from covering the nightly killings in the drug war to aftermath stories about trauma and such. It's very difficult. Until now, we're still finding stuff out about the drug war. Because some of the recent stories have been about how these drug war victims, or the remains of these drug war victims, their cemetery rental is up. So they're being exhumed. The remains are being exhumed out of cemeteries And there has been a forensic pathologist who looked into some of these bodies belatedly more recently, and she found out that a bunch of these victims have basically been listed in their medical certificates as having died of natural causes, even though their remains really show evidence of homicide. So we're still learning new stuff about the drug war even up until now. Whether or not there's going to be justice, it will probably depend on who the next president will be, because Marcos Jr. has definitely promised to continue the drug war. But a lot of experts aren't expecting him to necessarily be as iron-fisted as his father or as President Duterte. But it's quite clear, especially if his running mate, Sara Duterte, is also next to him in power, that there will hardly be any accountability for Duterte in a possible Marcos Duterte presidency, vice presidency. They can shield him basically from the International Criminal Court. So that's definitely one thing to watch out for. Definitely, Robredo is more likely to hold them to account because she's been a vocal critic of the drug war from the start.
Yeah, thank you. Looking at international coverage of the media, and this is possibly the last question because we've held you a long time, but what do you think of international coverage of the Philippines generally and of the election campaign in particular? And I know that, you're working for an international media outlet, so you don't need to necessarily talk about your employers, but I just overall, as someone from the Philippines, firstly, how do you view the coverage and what would be useful to be reported?
One thing that I did notice going around posts from Filipino circles is that people use international coverage currently to show Marcos supporting friends that this is how the world sees us. Because like I mentioned earlier, we kind of are pretty much in a campaign that's steeped in disinformation. It's a real upside down alternative universe where left is right. People don't believe in this long history of established corruption, which has already been accepted as fact in the worldwide eye, and which is on record basically through courts, through at the UN, etc. So people have been compiling a lot of international headlines and saying, guys, this is how the world sees us. So it's kind of been, in that sense, I think international coverage has been helpful and sobering at driving home how, these are this is what's going on. Moving forward, what should international media look at also, especially if it's going to be a fraught time for the local press in the coming months. And it's always been fraught, to be honest, in the Philippines. I mean, whoever president, even under Aquino, there's always been a culture of long-running impunity here that's not exclusive to just one president. But definitely, we will need the help of international journalists to complement the work that local journalists do, because local journalists have to care about access. They have to care, about talking to these sources on a regular basis. But journalists from abroad don't necessarily have to care about that, which is why a lot of the interesting stuff that has come out of the Philippines that has made a bit of a splash would be foreign documentaries like Kingmaker, 1,000 Cuts starring Maria Ressa, right? But definitely, I think Filipinos would be more open to this, but they would also be open to, I guess, stories where you ask Filipinos themselves, like, oh, what are the gaps in coverage? What are the stuff you cannot cover or are restricted from? That might be more easier for an international for a journalist with an international background to cover. So definitely.
And as someone from the Philippines, what are those topics? What are those stories?
Okay, definitely one off the top of my head, because I think I'm kind of wondering what to share without revealing all of the story pitches I have lined up
Okay, fair enough.
in my notebook, to be honest. But definitely, I think that the digital workers realm, more stuff on troll farms, more stuff on how political machinery operates. I think Filipinos find that fascinating, but it's very difficult for them to access. Some responses to my previous story, for example, would be, oh, we'd love to see a documentary of this. So I think that that's one area that probably might be helpful for international watchers to look at, because while local people might be able to cover it, they might also have to deal with political clients on a regular basis. Yeah, the political clients of these troll farms. So maybe that's one thing that we can look at. What else as well? Stuff like press censorship, I think, because definitely there has been a train of thought among locals that documentaries like The Kingmaker and A Thousand Cuts are quote unquote not enough because they're really tailor fit for foreign audiences, right? So my personal take on that is that I think each production has its own audience. So definitely, when you look at the literature, you can kind of also see or take a look at what are the leads that weren't really pursued in those documentaries, and then come up with stories that would be able to fill in that gap. One thing, for example, that we have yet to see a really clear documentation on, which I think would be interesting personally, would be the shutdown of ABS-CBN. I think that would greatly complement A Thousand Cuts, which covered Rappler. Rappler is a much smaller newsroom. And of course, they're fighting such a crucial battle. ABS-CBN was an 11,000 employee strong newsroom. And so many people lost their jobs. That's definitely one thing that I think would be interesting to look at.
Regina, thank you so much. It's been a really, really fascinating hour. Caitlin, would you like to ask your final question? Because you've put so much work into this.
Hey, magandang gabi. You said earlier that there was a multi-million-pound PR campaign for Marcos, and that he's going by the nickname BRB, so as not to draw attention to his dictatorial history, heritage. I've noticed throughout the seminar you've said Marcos. You never called him BRB, even though popularly that's now his name. Do you do that on purpose?
I think you mean BBM, right? Yeah.
BBM, sorry, thank you.
Bongbong Marcos.
Bongbong, thanks.
Yeah, to be honest, yes, because, and I think that's a habit that some of my colleagues as well have picked up. It's very interesting because definitely the last name comes with a lot of baggage, right? And one of the faults, I guess, of the Philippine media, the Philippine education system, the institutions, the courts, is that we haven't really managed to hold the family to account. We haven't been able to pass on the memory of collective trauma. It just hasn't been translated that well. So I guess in my own little way, because words matter, I would also kind of like to drive home that one of the things that definitely makes this election unique is that it is a Marcos running. It's like history all over again, but yassified. A tailor fit for a new generation, actually. But this time around, what are we going to do with it is the question.
Thank you. That's a brilliant answer and a brilliant note to end on. Words matter. What are we going to do with what our history is and what our future will be? Regine, please take care of yourself in the next few weeks, months, and we're admiring you wholeheartedly from a distance for your reporting and for your courage, and stay safe, and we'll watch out for the results next week as well. And take care, and thank you all so much for your time.